Hi there, welcome to Matrix Live Season 4, Episode 9. This week it's just me going and talking about Matrix somewhat for old time's sake. Ideally Amandine would be here, but she's still off for the summer. We'll be back next week. And thought it might be an idea just to talk through some of the projects which are going on from a high level as a kind of return to original Matrix Live, also to give a bit of context. So without further ado, Synapse, we saw 1.3 ship yesterday, which is a pretty exciting release because it has another massive wave of performance improvements. The main thing that people focused on this is going and optimizing the ability to look up who is currently in a room, something that happens an awful lot in Matrix and historically had been done almost from first principles every time, albeit with some caches to kind of bluntly speed it up, whereas the caching has now been shifted to be a lot more intelligent, and it maintains a constant in-database view of who is currently in a given room, and that in turn is cached. And in practice, this has sped up our the speed of sending messages and I/O and the database and CPU quite dramatically. Hopefully people on matrix.org have seen the difference, and we're getting reports as people upgrade that it's at least reduced their RAM a lot, as well as made things a lot more snappy. So that's nice. The next thing up on performance on Synapse is something called the Federation Sidebus project, which Amber, or Hawkow, is working on. And this is kind of interesting because when she was profiling Synapse for use in small hosted home servers, the offering from modular.im, which does small hosted home server hosting that we do as New Vector, she was looking at where the RAM was going and realized that a lot of the time, if you send a message in a room with lots of servers, even if it's not that complicated a room, we're seeing a big spike in memory usage, not due to state resolution, but just lots of concurrent HTTPS hits going out at the same time. And this gets particularly bad if some of the servers in the room are slow, because you end up really clogging up with an awful lot of concurrent hits happening. And the connection pooling should help with this to some extent, but we're not as rigorously enforcing the connection pooling as we should, and we certainly aren't doing any QoS on our outbound traffic. So what the Sidebus project does is to try to move more things into the Federation sender and go and queue up which HTTPS requests happen intelligently, so that one's talking to healthy servers for time-critical traffic, go through quickly, and one's talking to broken servers or for non-time critical stuff can happen much more slowly at a lower priority. And it just basically limits the number of requests in flight so that you don't suddenly spin up a gigabyte of RAM by trying to talk to 400 servers at precisely the same time to send a message. So it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. Also looked at a bit at speeding up state res, but the conclusion sounds as if this is going to be a bigger win than state res, so that's on hold for now. Other projects going on are open tracing to go and track down any remaining undecryptable messages. This is being done by Yorick as part of his internship, and it's looking really good. I think it's actually merging now for the next release of Synapse 1.4. And then another thing Yorick's working on, which is super exciting, is having a web installer for Synapse at last. So many people, particularly as we try to get more corporate types using Matrix, find that using a command line interface and YAML files for configuring Synapse is a complete pain in the ass. They'd much rather just run a simple installer, get a web interface pop up, and it steps you through the whole process of configuring the Synapse, testing that Federation works, testing that Turn is set up correctly, testing that you've saved all the bits of information that you need to recover the server in future, all that good stuff. So that's happening, and Nad has been helping with the design on that, and it's looking quite sexy. So I expect to see that soon. And also Oliver, who is also interning, has been working on getting a Turn server, a Turn tester up and running. And this will be, as I said, integrated with the installer, but hopefully we might even get a Echo service back again, which is something that we had pre-Matrix a long time ago, a VoIP test point that you could go and connect to, which would go and receive calls, actually record like 5 seconds of audio and video and play them back to you. We're not going to do that. It will just be echoing a simple data channel connection over Turn to check that you have WebRTC working correctly, but it should be much, much better experience for getting VoIP to work well. I think the plan is also to ship the extremities build-up workaround by default, which will hopefully mean we will never ever have to manually reap extremities. Woohoo! And otherwise in Synapse, there's been more security audit work going on, working through some of the lower priority stuff which got bumped out of the 1.0 release, which is really nice to see that stuff landing. And there has been work going on privacy, which I'll talk about in the context of Riot. So, on Riot, we've been worrying about privacy a lot. I'm sure people have seen that there is a campaign going on to point out each and every last possible privacy consideration there is in both Matrix and Riot. Obviously, we take privacy seriously. It hasn't always been the top priority relative to having a protocol that works or is secure. But now that we've got 1.0 out the door, it's an excellent opportunity to go and dig into a lot of the privacy corners which got cut. And there aren't that many. The biggest mess that was highlighted is that we forgot to do GDPR opt-in for use of identity servers and integration managers. So on all three Riot platforms, as well as the back-end APIs for the IS and the integration manager, we now have a completely different flow, which goes and prompts you to accept terms and conditions of those servers before you can use them. You might be thinking, why are we spending time messing around with annoying legalese pop-up boxes? But the reason is that from a legal perspective, we have no choice than to make sure that users know where their data is going through these systems. And it turns out to be a particularly fiddly thing. We have to change the spec, we have to change the implementations on the back end, we have to change it on the servers. There are 25 different ways of doing it each time. Getting momentum up and running on it to finish it has been quite hard, but we are in the final straight now. I think we were planning to ship it this week. I think there's still a couple of things which still need to land, and we still need to get some spec work done, but it's looking fairly promising. Other stuff on the privacy side is hashing contacts before they are looked up on the identity server. This one was a nightmare because it's a stupid thing that Moxie Marlinspike at Signal went and wrote a really good treatise on why private contact discovery is really hard. Because basically, if you have your address book in your phone and you want to see which of your contacts are on Matrix, you have to send all of the details of those contacts to the Matrix server or to the identity server to discover which of those contacts are on Matrix or not. Now, you could obfuscate those by hashing them somehow. However, it's never going to be that good a obfuscation because there are relatively few phone numbers and relatively few known email addresses out there. So even if you camouflage it somehow, the server is still able to compare it with a similarly camouflaged lookup of all the identifiers it might know about. And it's basically an insoluble problem. We looked at many, many different ways of approaching this with K anonymity, where you don't say precisely what information you do have. Instead, you basically say to the server, I have a phone number that looks something like this in my contacts. Do you have any that look something like that in your lookup table? And the server says, yes, here it is, and sends the details over. That also doesn't work though, because the server could well say, oh yes, of course I have precisely that fuzzy match on my side, and basically the server concludes in order to cheat the client into telling it about contacts which the server doesn't really have lookups for. Basically, the server can say, well, of course I have lookups for every phone number in the world to go to non-existent matrix IDs. So it's a bit of a fool's errand, honestly, trying to make this secure. However, what we can do is to go and just do some basic hashing and also rotate the seed used for that hash on a regular basis so that you would have to very maliciously, deliberately calculate new lookup tables or rainbow tables as they're called if you were trying to steal people's contact information. So that's what we've done in the end there, but my God, did it take a long time to get to that conclusion. Also work, as I mentioned, on Synapse, cleaning up metadata, specifically garbage collecting redacted messages at last. deleting media which is no longer wanted, and deleting media which is associated with redactions, hopefully, and also implementing history retention. This one has actually happened already for the French government deployment. And there is an MSc that I wrote called MSc 1763, which is all about allowing users to specify how long messages should be retained in a given room before they are deleted, full stop. And so we're getting that properly implemented in mainline Synapse, which will be a massive, massive win. I know it's why Disroot and Hackint and a couple of other Matrix servers gave up, because they were getting lots and lots of data and there wasn't an easy way to expire it. So that solution is almost here. And the final thing that we're doing on privacy is the absolute critical thing to go and limit the turn servers which your Riot tries to use for VoIP if you don't have a VoIP server set up. So previously we silently fell back to using Google's turn server as a stun thing to try to make VoIP work if you didn't have a proper one set up. People rightfully or wrongfully think this is a gross breach of privacy, and so we are going and giving folks the option to opt in to using the Google Turn server, or indeed override it with another one of their choice if their sysadmin hasn't set up a proper one. And again, this should help the UX a lot around VoIP, such that when a call fails, it tells you why and tries to point you towards the right server setting up Turn correctly. So that's it for the privacy side of things. Otherwise on Riot, honestly, privacy has been sucking up more and more time. Aggregation work is paused. Edits and reactions empirically seem to be working pretty well, even though there is a lot of the MSc that hasn't been fully implemented. It's a lot of edge cases like displaying reactions on permalinks and editable messages on permalinks, and a couple of other edge cases, but it's working so well that we've bumped that down the list for a few months. Next up, more importantly, is what we call FTUE, or First Time User Experience, which, let's face it, is shit right now in many respects on Riot. When you try to get one of your mates who knows nothing about Matrix to use it, they don't understand how to DM people. They don't understand how to create a room. They don't understand how to invite people. They don't know what a Matrix ID is. They shouldn't need to know what a Matrix ID is. There's so many things there which we still wanted to fix during the redesign back in Riot 1.0 in February. But in the end, the redesign ended up being a lot more about the cosmetics, and some bits got fixed, but some of the core matrixy bits hadn't been touched. So as soon as this privacy nightmare is over, we're going to be focusing as aggressively on first-time UX as we possibly can. And that is things like immutable DMs, so that there is only one way to DM somebody, and that DMs are very clearly identified as DMs. When you start a message to somebody, it doesn't randomly invite them to a room, and people say, why have I been invited to a room? I thought I was just DMing you. Whereas in doing things like automating that whole process of joining rooms so that you don't receive it and accept the invite and end up in a random blank room waiting for the other person to send their message. There are about 10 main bullet points on them. What else do we have? Let me quickly pull up a quick list. Fixing user discoverability, giving users the ability to just publish themselves by default in the address book if they want, because so many people sign up, tell their mate to find them on Riot, they type in Matthew return, and they get a whole bunch of Matthews coming up, but they don't find the person who just signed up, because of the whole thing that person needs to share a room or be in a public room. In practice, it's awful, and we just need to address that. Ability to invite, well, basically the ability to, that will in turn avoid the complexity of needing to know what NMX ID is, because if you search for a display name or a username and they turn up, then you don't need to mess around having to manually enter @username:\domain, which nobody in their right mind who isn't a developer isn't going to do. What else? Fixing the ability to join a room. The plus button in Riot to create or to join a room is very unintuitive. So fixing that. Slowness and local echo behavior in general. Joins are excruciatingly slow, something to be fixed on the server. Lots of ways of doing it. We know of ways of doing it. We just need to finally do it. Lagginess as well, in terms of local echo, that there are operations like inviting users, kicking users, banning users, where you often have to wait 5 seconds for the server to grind and get back to you to tell you that it's done the thing, whereas we should be just showing that locally and cancelling it if the server fails. Killing the letterboxes on left panel in Riot Web. It was an experiment that Amandine and I pushed forwards. In practice, it doesn't seem to be working. We're going for a much simpler left panel design, which in combination with communities should end up being much more manageable. Communities themselves come after the FTUE project, so we're not trying to solve that as part of this. But you get the idea that it's really a lot of relatively low-hanging, fixing the WTF moments that people have when they first start using Riot. What else? Cross-siding is also coming up. Cross-siding is finished, basically, at the SDK layer. The one thing that we haven't, that we want to do is to switch to tracking verification state in DMs. So when we have our one true immutable DMs, the idea is that when somebody verifies you, it will come up as a message that appears in the timeline in that DM, rather than being a very ephemeral, random dialog box which pops up and you cancel it, and you can never get it back again, and you can't remember what you verified and who you haven't verified. And if then Evil Maid takes over your account, it won't be clear whether they're verified people when you weren't looking, all that sort of thing. Instead, basically use the DM to track that work. And UX is blocked on the privacy stuff, irritatingly. So even though we've got the SDK up and running, and we've got text strigs showing it works, and we've got the spec showing that it works, there isn't anybody in position to really get stuck into gluing it into Riot Web, because we're all going around adding GDPR prompts to IS and IM UI. So that will be up next, and then beyond that, communities. Finally, on RiotX on mobile, 0.3 came out last week and looks great. Handles DMs, ironically using the old DM semantics. Sorry, guys. Lots of polishing being going on, and also reduces the size of the APK down to 10 megs, which is a very, very nice size for an app like Riot. So good work there on the RiotX side. Again, the Android and iOS guys are stuck doing the privacy dance that we've been doing on web. It should be a lot quicker because they can just copy what we've done there on web. And what else can be said there? The thing next up on Riot iOS is going to be similar to the FTUE. There's like 8 issues which constantly bite people on iOS that we want to iron out. And it's, again, sort of low-hanging maintenance polishing rather than big new features. And finally, on the bridges side of things, lots of work happening behind the scenes, moving bridges onto entirely new managed infrastructure. So getting them out of the old matrix.org data center and running them instead in much more managed environments. Bifrost should be back soon as part of that. The Gitter bridge kept breaking, but that's been fixed properly, working with the Gitter team, which is nice. And finally, we're also looking with the new managed bridges on how to hook them up into modular, so that if you are a modular customer, you can go and get your very own dedicated Slack or Telegram or whatever bridge. And we'll be experimenting on Tezos who want a very dedicated Telegram bridge set up for them, for instance, to see how that works. So that's roughly what's been happening, what's going on. In terms of priorities as a whole, yeah, I mean, that sort of gives an idea as to where things are at. I would ask if anybody had any questions, but it's a kind of one-way dialogue right now. So if you do have any questions, come onto Matrix HQ and throw them at me, or indeed onto Twim, and I can try to answer questions. And thanks for listening. Hope it's been useful to get an overview of where things are at from my perspective, and be back next week in some incarnation. Bye.